$800 billion. That is how much money 6 million Danish people have sitting in pension funds right now. Not the government, not the banks, the workers. For scale, that is more than twice Denmark's entire economy. France's pension reserves equal 10% of GDP, Germany's 8%, Denmark's 220%. The state pension in Denmark pays $1,500 a month. That is the government's contribution. By European standards, that is nothing special. The rest, the 70–80% of retirement income that puts Danish workers among the best compensated retirees in the world, comes from a parallel system that the government did not build, does not control, and cannot touch. 6 million people. $800 billion, and the state had almost nothing to do with it. It did not come from Nordic generosity. It did not come from high taxes or a government that decided to care more about old people than other governments do. It came from a near bankruptcy in the 1980s and a backroom deal struck between unions and employers that politicians were deliberately kept out of. The reason no other country in Europe has managed to replicate it, and why they almost certainly never will, explains something important about how retirement security actually works, and why most of the continent is quietly heading toward a crisis that Denmark already saw. When a Danish worker retires, they receive between 80 and 90% of their pre-retirement income. Every month. For life. France manages 60%. Germany 55%. The United Kingdom 45%. Denmark sits at the top of that list by a significant margin. The natural assumption is that this is what an expensive welfare state looks like. Generous government, high taxes, take care of the elderly well. That assumption is wrong. The state pension pays $1,500 a month and no more. That number has not changed in any meaningful way for years. What changed, what built the $800 billion, is a mandatory occupational pension system that runs completely parallel to the state, funded by workers and employers, governed by unions and businesses, and structured specifically so that no government official can vote to redirect the money. Denmark did not build superior retirement outcomes through state generosity. It built them by taking capital out of politics entirely and forcing it to grow for decades. Through the 1980s, Denmark ran its pension system the same way most of Europe still does today. Current workers pay taxes. Those taxes go directly to current retirees. Simple, clean, completely dependent on having enough young workers to keep the transfer going. By the late 1980s, the math was breaking. Debt had crossed 60% of GDP. Birth rates were falling. The ratio of workers to retirees was moving in the wrong direction and accelerating. The system, as designed, was heading toward insolvency. The government did not fix it. Between 1993 and 1999, labor unions and employer federations negotiated mandatory occupational pensions through collective bargaining agreements that covered the entire workforce. Not through Parliament, not through any legislation that a future government could reverse, through contracts between workers and businesses. Contribution rates settled at 12 to 18% of salary, split between employers and employees. By the year 2000, 85% of Danish workers were enrolled. The government's role was to create tax incentives that made participation essentially automatic. Nothing more. Denmark's pension system was not built by politicians deciding to be generous. It was built by workers and businesses deciding they did not trust politicians with their retirement money and then constructing a system where politicians would never need to be trusted. That single decision to keep the capital outside the political system turned out to be the most consequential financial choice Denmark made in the entire 20th century. 3 structural features explain why it worked when similar attempts elsewhere collapsed. The first is that the system is funded rather than pay-as-you-go. In France, Germany, and most of Southern Europe today, the money workers pay in taxes goes directly to the retirees who are alive right now. When the working population shrinks, which it is, across all of Europe, the system deteriorates. Fewer workers covering the same number of retirees means a growing structural deficit that compounds every year the birth rate stays low. Danish workers do not pay current retirees. They accumulate capital in individual accounts that compound over 40 years. The system does not depend on demographics. It runs on investment returns, and investment returns do not care how many children Danes are having. Enrollment is mandatory through collective agreements. No opting out, no exceptions. This matters because the moment a system becomes optional, the workers most likely to leave are healthy, high-earning people who believe they will not need the safety net. What remains is a pool weighted toward those who expect to draw benefits most heavily. The fund weakens. Exits accelerate. Eventually, the math fails the same way pay-as-you-go does. Professional managers control the investments. Danes do not pick their own pension allocations. AP, the state-linked fund managing $140 billion, allocates capital alongside private funds like PFA and Pension Denmark. This avoids what quietly destroyed millions of American retirements. Individual investors managing their own 401k accounts, panic selling during market crashes, then watching the recovery happen without them. 3 decisions: funded model, mandatory coverage, professional management. Everything that follows is a product of those 3 choices made in the early 1990s. What those funds did with the capital is the part that separates Denmark from every other pension system in Europe. Most European pension funds invest conservatively. Government bonds, large-cap equities, low volatility. They average 4 to 6% annually over 20 years. Danish funds average 7 to 9%. 3 percentage points sounds modest. Compounded over a 40-year career, it is the difference between retiring comfortable and retiring wealthy. A worker contributing $100,000 over a career accumulates roughly $700,000 at 8% returns. At 5%, the same contributions produce $450,000. Same worker, same discipline, 55% less money from allocation strategy alone. Danish funds put 30% of assets into infrastructure, private equity, and real estate. Most European peers sit at 10 to 15%. Pension Denmark owns 50% of Copenhagen Airport. AP holds equity in Ørsted, the wind energy company that now powers a significant share of Northern Europe. GEA has invested billions in offshore wind farms across Germany and the Netherlands. The logic is a straightforward match of timelines. Pension obligations run 40 years. Infrastructure assets pay back over 40 years. Standard equity investors cannot hold these positions. Quarterly performance pressure makes multi-decade payback periods impossible to justify to shareholders. Pension funds with locked capital and long horizon liabilities are the only buyers who fit. Denmark's funds moved into that gap and captured returns that nobody else could stay patient enough to collect. The renewable energy stakes alone generate 6 to 8% with inflation protection written into long-term power contracts. And the infrastructure investment creates a productivity loop. Airports, energy grids, metro systems raise output across the economy. Wages follow productivity, higher wages increase contributions, and the pension system partially finances the growth that sustains its own returns. If the system produces results this clear, and the data says it does, the question worth asking is why Germany is not building one, why France is not, why the United Kingdom has not. The answer is institutional, and it is effectively permanent. Denmark's model requires 67% union density, with unions powerful enough to negotiate industry-wide agreements that cover entire sectors in a single contract. Germany's union density sits at 17%. France's at around 11%. At those levels, you cannot enforce mandatory contributions across an economy through bargaining. You would need legislation. And legislation means politicians design the rules, which means the capital eventually becomes politically accessible. The United Kingdom tried in 2012 with auto-enrollment. Contribution rates were set at 8%, less than half of Denmark's minimum. Opt-outs undermined universality from the beginning. The architecture was approximately right. The political capacity to enforce it was not. There is also a trade at the center of Denmark's model that most countries cannot replicate. Businesses accepted mandatory pension contributions because unions delivered wage restraint in return. That exchange requires organizational capacity on both sides simultaneously. Strong enough unions to enforce coverage, disciplined enough employers to honor the terms. In most of Europe, that institutional muscle no longer exists. The countries that built funded pension systems and then faced fiscal pressure did not reform them. They took the money, Argentina nationalized private pensions in 2008 to fill budget gaps. Poland seized 50% of pension fund assets in 2014 to reduce its official debt ratio. Hungary forced workers back to pay-as-you-go in 2010 and confiscated what had accumulated over years of contributions. Denmark's governance makes that move impossible. ATP's board splits equally between labor unions and employer federations with no government appointments. Seizing the pension fund means going to war with organized labor and the entire business community at the same time. No government survives that coalition. So no government tries. Back to the number that opened this. $800 billion. 6 million people. That capital exists not because Denmark cared more about its elderly or spent more generously or taxed its workers into submission. It exists because in the early 1990s, unions and employers made a deal to lock money somewhere that no future government could reach, and then built governance structures designed to make sure it stayed there regardless of which party held power. Every country watching its pension system strain under demographic pressure faces the same problem Denmark faced in 1989. Fewer workers. More retirees. Arithmetic that does not hold. Denmark solved it before the crisis fully arrived and built institutions that made the solution irreversible. Most of Europe extended the promises and moved the reckoning forward. That reckoning has not gone away. Denmark just will not be part of it. The pension system is the clearest version of something that shows up across every video on this channel about Denmark. It is not a country that runs on good intentions. It runs on structures that produce the right outcome regardless of intentions. The money is locked. The returns are real. The math works because the system was designed to function without anyone needing to be trusted.